All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace be upon you all, and welcome to another discussion on Finding Truth channel. And today I'm happy to have with me Pat Flynn, who is a writer, a podcaster, and a philosopher. And he lives in Wisconsin, USA. And today we will be discussing the problem of evil as part of the bigger umbrella of maybe God exists, because problem of evil has been I'm not sure, I don't think recently, but since some long time, maybe since Greek philosophy, right, has been there as one of the arguments about this topic. So Pat, welcome to the channel.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, Ahmed. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for being here. So since you are the philosopher, why don't you start by telling us what is the problem of evil?
Yeah,
and
sure. Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned it goes way back, right? It goes back to at least the Epicurean paradox, right? If God is all powerful, he can create any world he wants. If he's all good, then he wouldn't create a world with suffering and evil. And hey, look around, explain that, right? Explain that. So we'll come back. We'll come back to that, right? I think there's a lot of stage setting that I like to do in a conversation like this, because one, it's not the problem of evil, it's the problems of evil. There's a lot going on here, and I think if nothing else, it'll be helpful to just try and give the 10,000 foot overview, if that makes sense, right? So yeah, problems of evil, right? Let's just make some classifications, right? One is what I like to mark off as the sort of intellectual problem of evil versus the practical or lived problem of evil, right? We all deal with suffering in our lives. And my general posture is to assume that what people deal with is just far worse than most of us realize most of the time, right? That's the sort of lived problem of evil, the suffering we have in our own lives, the tragedies that we have endured, the trauma that has affected us throughout all of our life. That's inevitable, right? That's a pastoral concern to my mind, right? And I don't want to downplay that, but that's not the problem of evil that we're going to be talking about here. We're going to be talking about the intellectual problem of evil. And the intellectual problem of evil is one of coherence. And when we're talking about theism and atheism, we're talking about large-scale competing theories of reality as a whole, right? And the problem of evil, the problems of evil, are raised as various coherence objections, right? Now, coherence with respect to theories, roughly speaking, is how well do things fit together, right? So something that is really coherent, we can kind of see how everything fits together. It's very elegant. Things just kind of snap into place, right? But pretty much every theory has various degrees of coherence issues, right? Now, the worst form of coherence issue would be some type of contradiction. And that's not just seeing, that's just, so for example, there might be issues in a theory where we don't see how things fit together, right? But we also don't see that they do not fit together. A contradiction is where we see that they do not fit together, like a square circle or something like that. So contradictions are really bad, because unless you're an exotic brand of philosopher, you probably think contradictions are impossible, right? Certainly when it comes to the ontological aspect, right? You're never going to get something like a square circle or whatever. So if somebody can pick a contradiction out of your theory, can draw some type of contradiction out, that theory is in trouble, right? That's bad, right? And so that would be what I might call the strong form problem of evil. And the strong form problem of evil. Yeah, go ahead.
You're making a statement here that in terms of realism, things that are real, they need to be coherent. Yeah. So if you have contradiction, then this thing cannot be real.
So when I take the principle of non-contradiction, I think it's not just a law of thought, but a law of being. That's correct.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and I think most people probably grant us that, right? Now, philosophers will disagree about anything, so you'll have people that challenge that, but we'll just we'll save that for a different episode, right? So yes, right. So the strongest form, or the worst form, I guess we would say, of incoherence is trying to pick out a contradiction of something, right? And the strong form problem of evil is trying to do that. It's saying there's some type of just strict contradiction between a theistic view, or at least a particular theistic view, and the occurrence of evil and suffering in the world, right? It's not explicit. Nobody says it's explicit, but there's something in there, right? where we can draw out a contradiction between an all-loving, all-powerful God and the occurrence and existence of evil. This would be kind of like your Epicurean paradox type of problem of evil, right? I think it's important for people to realize that this is an area where I think there's been genuine philosophical progress, right? Where theists and atheists tend to agree that there is no strict contradiction here, right? The strong form logical problem of evil is really, it's really sort of in the philosophical dustbin, if you will, right? And that there's like broad agreement there. Now, every once in a while, you'll have somebody who comes up with a new argument who tries to resuscitate it, but by and large, philosophers are in agreement that this is kind of dead, right? Nobody's ever been able to get the strong form problem of evil to go through. They try and get the a contradiction out, but the theist always has enough responses to show that the assumption will not go through that does that, right? We'll talk more detail about what those assumptions are as we move along. I'm just trying to do some stage setting here, right? So the conversation has kind of moved along now towards more what are called evidential or probabilistic problems of evil, right? And this is where the skeptic will say, okay, maybe there's not just a straightforward contradiction between God and evil, but let's just take a look at either the qualities of evil, the types of evil, or the sheer cumulative weight of evil. And through some type of analysis, we're going to make an argument that this just seems to make God's existence very improbable, right? Not impossible, but very improbable, right? This would be a type of argument advanced by philosophers like Bill Rowe, for example, skeptical philosophers like Bill Rowe. And this is called the evidential or probabilistic problem of evil, right? So we've got two problems of evil out so far. We've got a kind of strong form logical problem of evil. We've got an evidential problem or probabilistic problem of evil. Like all else considered, it just seems like something about evil makes God's existence just very slim, statistically very slim, right? All right. There's a third class of problem of evil. This one's kind of more classic, and it doesn't get talked about much anymore. But there's sort of the metaphysical problem of evil, right? And this comes in with more specific theistic claims, right? Saying claims that God is the cause of everything distinct from himself, right? And that if God is the cause of everything distinct from himself, then wouldn't he have to be the cause of evil? There seems to be sort of an issue here, right? Like metaphysically, not just in terms of justification for allowing evil, but God like actively brings evil about. And the traditional response here that's shared among many different theists of many different stripes, Christians and Muslims and even various pagans, is that there's sort of an ontological asymmetry between good and evil, right? That whatever else evil is, it's not on the same ontological par as goodness, right? And on its final analysis, it would seem like evil always has to, in some sense, depend upon good to be conceptually coherent, right? This links back to a great tradition known as the privationist theory of evil, that upon its final analysis, what evil is always, it's actually something missing from the order of reality. It's a do-good gone missing. Now, if this is right, it actually does a lot of work for the theist, because then they no longer are committed to God being the sort of positive creator of evil, right? Because it's not something that you can put your hands around as a really existing thing. It's something that should be there, but for some reason it isn't there. So now we have the question of, well, why is that absence there? Why is that hole there, right? And that's still an important question. But the privationist account is sort of how the theist is traditionally done with what I would classify as the metaphysical problem of evil. Now, that hasn't been as much of a concern these days in philosophy of religion, but it's something that's always personally interested me. We can talk about it if we want. Most of I think the debates these days are around these sort of evidential problems of evil. So Ahmed, the whole thing I want to do there is just kind of like set the stage of how the problem of evil was thought about in different ways and make it clear that it's problems of evil. It's not just problem of evil. And let's hear your thoughts, and we can take the conversation in any direction you want. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So one of the things that struck me is, coming from an Islamic background, I found that the problem of evil is so pronounced in the Greek philosophy and in the Christian tradition and the Christian theologians and philosophers. Way more it is pronounced in the Islamic theology or Islamic philosophy. And one of the topics I would like to discuss with you here is why is that the case? Of course, you know more about Christian theology and the Christian culture than me, and I might also contribute to the Islamic part.
Right.
But it just strikes me that I see so much controversy and so much discussion around that in the Christian world, and it being used as an argument for atheism even. The antithesis of Christianity is atheism, and many people, in the West, and many people would say, okay, that's why I'm an atheist, because with all this evil, God cannot be good, and so he either does not exist, or maybe we should not worship a God who is not good. So it strikes me that this is the case, and so when I just look into this, did some analysis to it, I think that there are some important aspects of the Islamic philosophy or the Islamic worldview that makes this problem not there or not that pronounced, maybe.
Sure.
So maybe that's something that we might also discuss. But
yeah, I'd love to explore that. And I think it's going to vary among Christians as well significantly, right? And even for me, I'm a Catholic, right? Even within the Catholic tradition, there's different ways of thinking about this and responding to it, right? And that's just the nature of things, right? So you're gonna have some in the Catholic tradition, right? Like some Thomists who really aren't bothered much by the problem of evil. Because at the end of the day, they're gonna mark off certain distinctions pretty quickly and try and resign the problem of evil to just one big category mistake. So, for example, if you take a Thomist like a Brian Davis, very well-known Thomistic philosopher, and the way that Thomists are generally going to think about ethics and moral obligations, they're gonna argue that our moral obligations sort of flow from our nature, right? Our created nature. This is an essentialist worldview, right? And so, we have certain moral obligations that flow from the type of thing that we are that just aren't going to apply to God, right? So it's not going to make sense to accuse God of certain injustices that just categorically don't apply to God because he's not bound by a human nature. He's the creator of human nature, right? So now some people find that response cold. I think there's actually a lot to it. But if you just mark that off right away, as many Thomists do, then there's not much of a problem of evil left. Now, people might not find that emotionally satisfying, right? Because we still feel like, okay, granted, right? We shouldn't be anthropomorphic when thinking about God and whether God has moral obligations or stuff like that. But I think people have an intuition, and I generally want to agree with this, even though I would want to qualify it, that we can know enough about God through philosophy and revelation to still have broad moral expectations of God, even if we don't want to say that God has moral obligations in the way that we have moral obligations, right? So, does that make sense?
Yeah, because I was just going to say the same. So, for example, in Islam, we know that in the Quran and in Hadith, God makes some commitments concerning some things that he obliges himself to observe. So Hadith is a quotation of the Prophet. Yeah. So one of them is a Hadith Qudsi, which means that he is quoting God, and he says, "O my servants, or O my slaves, I have made oppression or injustice haram, which means forbidden, upon myself, and I have made it forbidden amongst you. So do not be unjust to each other." So looking at this kind of quotation, God is making himself the moral role model. So injustice or oppression is haram or forbidden, and he has started by himself. So he's making a commitment that he is never going to be unjust, or he is not going to be oppressive. There would be another Hadith Qudsi, which is also a quotation by the Prophet, as if quoting God. It's not in the Quran, but it's hadith.
Mm-hmm.
It's an important distinction in Islam. And it says, translation of meaning, that it is written above the throne. He's referring to the throne of God. Inna rahmati sabaqat ghadabi. Surely my mercy precedes my wrath. Mm-hmm. So mercy comes first. So if there is a situation where God can be, merciful or angry, he can morally take one of the two choices. He would choose to be merciful. This is his choice. Mm-hmm. And he is telling us this so that we can follow this model. And it also relates to something that we have common in both our traditions, that humans are created at the image of God. Mm-hmm. And in Islam, it doesn't mean that God has a face and hands and legs and a body, but it means that we are created in his image. Maybe it has a metaphorical meaning, or an ethical meaning, or a moral meaning, that we should follow his role model. And he sends prophets so that those prophets are humans and they become exemplars of such role model on earth in a humanly manner, so that we can follow them to the extent that, because we cannot directly follow God because we do not see him in day-to-day operation. Mm-hmm. So maybe in the Christian tradition, for example, you have something like the quotation of Jesus, I am the way and life, right? I think the remainder of it is no, and nobody goes to the Father except through me, or something,
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we have something similar to that in Islam.
Sure.
And it means that if you want to be joined with God in paradise, the way is through following his prophets to the extent that you deserve his company, because he is merciful. So people who are not merciful do not deserve his company. He is just, so people who are oppressive do not, and so on. So yes, in my tradition, for example, yes, we have access to understand whether God is moral or not moral, and what kind of constraints is God subject to, except that, not like the philosophical way, we understand that those constraints can only be there because God makes a commitment towards them.
Sure, they're conditional constraints. Yeah,
yeah. He said he would not be unjust, so this is why he is not unjust, not because he cannot be unjust, but he's just, it's a choice that he is making versus his creatures who have free will, so that we can follow him in using our free will in the same way. So it's so I suggest something. Maybe we should take all three types that you have talked about.
Yeah. I want to come back to the things that you put out there, because there's just, there's so much to consider here. And for me, a lot of it comes to a lot of philosophy of God too. Like, what can we know about God through natural theology and just in pure human reason? And then, is that going to set any constraints, right? And if so, what are the boundaries of that? We can think about that later. I just want to flag it to come back to, right? Because I think my answer is yes. There are certain constraints, right, that can lead to us having at least broad moral expectations of God. Like, I don't think God would create one world with just a burning kitten in it for all eternity for fun, right? Like, I think that's radically incoherent. So, like, my view of modality from my philosophy of God is that, like, that's just not even a possible world, right? And it flows from a deeper understanding that I think we can know about God's nature, for example. Now, that's like a really far off example, but, like, to me, like, that's wherever the boundaries are, that's beyond them, right? Right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll come back to that. Let's go back to the problems of evil. Why don't we just start with the evidential one, because I think it'll help take care of the logical problem of evil. Yeah. And the general response to the logical problem of evil has always been, well, look, there can be some good, morally sufficient, justified reasons for God creating an imperfect world, right? And then we can try to give a story about what those reasons are. Now, here's some more distinctions we have to make. In the philosophy of religion, we have a distinction between what's called a defense and a theodicy. Now, defense is just a philosophical move where we're trying to block the problem of evil. And we're trying to show, like, this is why this argument doesn't go through, right? That's a defense. It's not trying to give a story of why God allows particular evils. That's a theodicy. So a theodicy might draw on many different resources. It could be purely philosophical. It might draw on resources from Revelation, from or whatever, right? But it tries to give more of a story or an account of why God allows particular evils and suffering, right? But there's a difference between the two, because, and most of my work has just been on the matter of defense, of showing why problems of evil fail. Theodicies, there's many out there. We can talk about them. I don't have any particular one that I'm, especially attached to. There's some that I favor, I think are very plausible, but most of my thinking has been by way of defense, right? So let's think about this, right? Let's think about how the problem of evil actually points to rather than away from the existence of God. Because what I want to argue at the end of the day, Ahmed, is that evil itself, on its final analysis, is actually better expected on a theistic worldview than an atheistic worldview. And if that's the case, then that data point, evil, is actually evidence for God's existence, not evidence away from God's existence. But we have to do a little bit of stage setting and think about this, right? So we'll use the kind of like standard tool of Bayesian probability here. And we can kind of figure this out generally by asking a couple of simple questions, right? We have some data point, call it D, and we can ask how likely or expected would this data point be on a particular hypothesis, call that H, right? And then we can ask, okay, how likely or expected would that data point be not on that hypothesis, without that hypothesis, H, right?
Yeah.
And this will be, I think, best illuminated by way of example. So I'm going to borrow a quick illustration from a friend of mine. He's an epistemologist, Tim McGrew, and he gives this example to kind of show how we use this type of reasoning, every day, very instinctively, right? So imagine you're walking in the woods and you encounter what looks like an abandoned cabin, right? It looks decrepit. The door's falling off. There's weeds kind of growing all over. So you form a hypothesis. This cabin is abandoned, right? It's just kind of what naturally, the evidence there suggests to you that the cabin is abandoned, right? But then you go into the cabin and you realize there is a cup of hot tea steeping on a table, right? Now, what do? Immediately, you revise your hypothesis and you say, this cabin's occupied. It's not abandoned. Now, why do you do that, right? The reason you do it is you realize that the probability or the likelihood of finding a cup of hot tea steeping in an abandoned cabin is like virtually nothing, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like your degree of expectation of finding that data point on the hypothesis that this cabin is abandoned is, if it's not impossible, but it's really, really, really low, right? Now, what's the likelihood or degree of expectation that you'll find a cup of tea if the cabin is occupied? I don't know what the exact probability is. I don't think anybody knows. But here's the thing. It might actually even be low. And I think it is low, right? I don't think that there's like a very high probability that any given house or cabin I walk into, there's going to be a cup of tea there, right? However, it's the ratio between the two. Because whatever the specific probabilities are, I know it's far, far, far more likely that I'm going to find a cup of steeping tea in a cabin that's occupied rather than a cabin that's abandoned, right? So my encountering that data point is evidence for one hypothesis over another. And in fact, it's such strong evidence that I immediately revise my entire hypothesis just on that data point, right? So this is, we engage in this type of reasoning all the time, right? Now, here's what I want to have people think about with the evidential problem of evil. I have an extended article on this. Actually, I have two articles on this. One is on the website Catholic Answers, and we can link it in the show notes if people want more of the details here. But what I want to argue is, if atheism were true, I wouldn't expect there to be a problem of evil, because I wouldn't expect there to be evil at all. And the reason for this is that evil itself, to make sense of the judgment that something is objectively failing, something is objectively wrong, is contingent upon so many other conditions that are either best explained or only possibly explained by a theistic worldview. What would this be? Well, One is we need some type of moral standard, right? Something to sort of weigh our moral reasoning against, right? Now, classical theism locks in a moral standard if God just is the subsistent good itself, right? So if classical theism is true, then just by logic and definition, a moral standard is already on the scene, right? We also need conscious, rational, moral agents like us, right? Living in a moral community that somehow have some way of thinking about or connecting or reflecting upon the moral standard, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's another thing, all right? That's also going to, it's also contingent upon a contingent, finely tuned universe to make those conditions possible, right? So you see what I'm doing? Like, in order to make sense of evil, in order to make sense of the complaint of evil as it being a really bad thing, it's contingent upon all this other data, all these other features that are either better predicted and explained by, or only possibly explained by a theistic worldview rather than an atheistic worldview. So say I take a physicalism, and I think that essentially all that reality is dust, particles, motion, right? How do I get a moral standard out of that? How do I get moral reasoning out of something that is inherently amoral and nonsense, irrational? The answer is if it's not impossible, which I personally think it is impossible, the probability is really, 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 really low, right? Far lower than it is if we have God, who, in being perfectly good, would have reasons to create beings like us that could, in some sense, have powers of moral reasoning, whatever your moral epistemology is, right? So it's not unlikely. In fact, I think it's strongly expected that the type of world we see and the data we encounter, including evil, is really the sort of thing we would expect if God exists. But it's not at all the sort of thing we would expect if most forms, pretty much all forms of atheism were true. So you see the deeper point I'm getting at here, right? Is that evil itself, on its final analysis, when we think about all that goes into the judgment that we make about evil, evil itself is a contingent reality upon all these other myriad factors that are either better or best, or if only explained on the theistic hypothesis rather than the atheistic hypothesis. Going back to that illustration, then, encountering evil, to my mind, is like encountering that cup of steeping tea, right? It's evidence for rather than away from the existence of God. And I think that's the right way to think about it. Now, again, is that going to be emotionally satisfying to people? I have no idea. But I think in just a cold, rational analysis, if we're just taking a deep, hard look at what evil is, our moral judgments, our moral intuitions, moral epistemology, metaphysics, all of that, atheism doesn't predict evil. In fact, atheism doesn't predict much of anything, right? But it's the
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I think I've made my general thrust of the case of how the evidential problem of evil is actually evidence for God rather than against God. Mm-hmm.
So let me extend this. So let's assume that atheism is true, and see if we reach a contradiction here. So if atheism is true and life is biology driven by evolutionary mechanisms, then let's assume now, okay? Mm-hmm. And then we look at animals, for example, where, an animal can eat another animal and he doesn't feel sorry about it. He's just living his life, right? And a bird can steal your food and it doesn't, feel like a thief, or a cat or something can do the same. Mm-hmm. And now putting a conscious being with free will like us in the picture, and we do not perceive killing somebody else or stealing his food as okay, we feel guilt. It means that once you have free will and a higher level of consciousness, a moral standard comes into existence, which is not exemplified by the materialistic world around us. So once there's this element of consciousness and free will, there's this higher level of engagement between what we call a soul and our material bodies, and there is this higher connection, which is the theistic view, with the source of all of this, which is God. Then there is a moral standard immediately at play on that stage. Otherwise, why does an atheist say that killing is bad? There are so many atheists today arguing that there can be an atheistic moral value or something, because it is as if you would not do to your neighbor except what you would expect him to do to you, and this kind of stuff. But if this was true, then why is it not applicable to animals too? Why do they just eat each other and etc.? So I think yes, I completely agree with you. The very existence of this distinction between what's good and what's bad, what's evil and what's not evil, is an indication that God actually exists. And so
I want to say a few things about that. Those are some very good remarks, Ahmed. I mean, look, atheism, like theism, comes in many different flavors, right? So there are many atheists who are reductionist, physicalists, or whatever, that at least seem to want to accept a moral nihilism, right? And in fact, there's a number of atheists out there who will argue that you have to be a nihilist if you're going to be an atheist, right? Old atheists argued this, and there's new atheists like Alex Rosenberg, right? Now, that isn't giving an explanation of the data. That's explaining data away, right? Right. Let's and we can give defenses that do, like, we can't just explain away the moral realm and moral facts and stuff like that, right? So to me, if the atheist takes that, then you've just admitted that your theory is explanatorily inadequate. Like, it's just not on an explanatory par with theism, right? And I think there's certain things that are certainly independently defensible, but are just also basically obvious, right? That there is a moral realm, right? That we really do have free will as well, right? Now, some atheists will just deny this, but they'll deny it because they think it's incompatible with their worldview. And I'll say, that's right, it is incompatible with your worldview, and those are some very good reasons to give that worldview up, right? Right? If you're forced in a position where you have to deny so many obvious aspects of reality, and atheists go farther than that, not just our moral sense, not just our sort of rational appetite or freedom of the will and stuff like that. Some of them will deny consciousness altogether. Some of them will deny meaning. Some of them will deny rationality. And so, their worldview keeps reducing to one absurdity after another, right? Not all atheists like that, right? So what other atheists will do is they'll try and wire more things into their theory, which always increases the complexity of their theory, right? Now we were supposed to be sold on atheism as being a simpler theory, but now for atheism to get up to an explanatory par with theism, it's only going to do that if it's vastly more complex than theism, right? So now atheists will have to start building in things like teleological arrows and brute necessities and all sorts of ad hoc contrived moves to try and get the same sort of explanatory force that theism, which just posits just one very fundamental, perfectly simple reality, God, already predicts and explains, right? So the atheists can certainly do that if they want, and they can try and be like an atheistic moral Platonist or any of these things. But to my mind, it's always going to be inadequate for so many other reasons. And now you've completely lost the game in terms of other explanatory virtues as well, including simplicity and stuff like that. So I just want to acknowledge there's other forms of atheism out there. I call them like exotic naturalism, forms of exotic naturalism, right? That essentially just try and bring back things into an atheistic worldview, like formal and final causality and teleological arrows and all sorts of other stuff, right? That has for a long time been sort of seen as unacceptable, metaphysically unacceptable among atheists. But now they're realizing, well, crap, now we can't explain so much of reality. We kind of need to bring this stuff back in. And then I also call these theories kind of theism light. It's like, you just come on, like you're like practically there, like just go all the way at this point, right? So just trying to give a fair view of the landscape is all, right? Mm-hmm. I hope it makes sense, but at the end of the day,
it makes plenty of sense, and in many dialogues I have seen exactly what you're mentioning. So you'll find the atheistic worldview, going reductionist until it's completely absurd. Mm-hmm. And then, for example, you have a debate with somebody, and then you tell him, explain consciousness. And then he says, well, maybe consciousness is a fundamental,
then they
part
bring
of
in
reality.
right. Then they bring in panpsychism or ideas of proto-consciousness and stuff like that.
And suddenly he's like into Hinduism or something, and but
Right,
without
no,
the
yeah.
God, without the Brahman, without the God aspect. It's just consciousness is part of the material universe. Okay, so why?
Right. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and we were talking about panpsychism, and it's like, well, like, what do you mean? Like, if you mean that just there's something about fundamental reality and consciousness is rooted there, then yeah, theists aren't going to really disagree with that, right? Right?
Yeah.
If you're going to talk about theories of like proto-consciousness or fading quality or stuff like that, I'm going to say that's nonsense, right? Consciousness is something that's just either there or it's not, right? You don't have something that's just like kind of on its way to being conscious, right? It makes no sense, right? Like something either represents something. It might, here's a way to think about it, right? It might represent less, but it's not any less of a representation, right?
Yeah.
The latter is incoherent, right? So yeah, any theories of like fading quality or stuff like that, I think are just radically incoherent. And if you're just saying that consciousness is in some sense fundamental, the theist will be like, yeah, welcome to the club, guys, right?
Yeah, let's call that God, and then surrender to the fact, right or not?
Right.
Yeah, but they would just reject that, and it's very. I don't know how. Maybe we can just do a side note there. Can you explain to me how philosophically can an atheist be self-consistent and just continue to be? How can that be a rational position, given everything that we see around us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't speak for all atheists, but I can speak for myself because we didn't mention this, Ahmed, but I'm a convert, right? I had a long period of religious and theistic skepticism, right? And what brought me out of that was not coming across natural theology and finding arguments for the existence of God. What brought me out of it was exploring the options available to an atheist to make sense of reality, going deeper into them and realizing that they were horribly inadequate and did keep reducing to the absurd. And I was of the position that there are certain aspects of reality that I'm not only not going to give up, because I think there's good reason to really believe that we have good evidence for these things, like a moral realm, like consciousness, like free will, right? But that, like, I wouldn't even know how to operate even if I wanted to give them up, right? So it was sort of me trying to make the best I could philosophically out of atheism that caused me to abandon atheism, right? So I can only speak from my perspective on this, right? And that didn't immediately make me a Christian or even any particular type of theist. It just made me want to reconsider things anew and afresh, right? And then I kind of went on this kind of much wider, more searching journey and wound up where I did, and realized that classical theism seemed to be able to explain the most with the least. That's how I'll put it. It seemed to be able to explain the most with the least. I then spent a very long time researching and writing about aspects of natural theology, philosophy of God. And that's where I am now, right? That there were just, features of the world that we have good evidence for that are, in fact, I think, undeniable at the end of the day without radical incoherence. I needed a worldview that could make sense of this, that had coherence, right? Good coherence. Doesn't mean it's free of any challenges or difficulties. We're trying to work through one of those now, right? But that could explain the most with the least. And theism, classical theism, just did it for me. And it still does it for me, right? So, I mean, for me, when I realized that I couldn't keep going on consistently as an atheist, that just caused me to give up atheism. Now, how do other people do it? I still read a lot of atheists. And, so you do have some of the eliminativists that just say that morality isn't something we discover, it's something we invent, something we throw off into the world. And, they never live consistently with themselves. So, because they're always making moral condemnations, they're always praising people, they're always blaming people, they're always making moral judgments. Certainly on Twitter, they're doing that. So, in their academic papers, they'll say one thing and then they'll immediately engage a performative contradiction, and here come all my moral judgments again. So at the very least, you always have this sort of inner tension with people like that, right? Again,
Yeah.
that's not all atheists, but it's a lot of the reductionists who act like that. They'll say one thing, they'll act another. So those performative tensions are always, I think telling. And then plus there's also I think this is important, right? There's a normative web here. And we have a moral sense. Nobody would deny that we have a moral sense. And then the question is that moral sense something that's generally reliable, or is it just utter delusion, right? And what I want to argue is that there's sort of a package deal of all of our cognitive powers, right? If we start to cast a strong doubt on one of our powers, one of our senses, a moral sense, it seems to be hard to not cast doubt on all of our cognitive powers, all of our senses. You see what I'm saying here, right? Just as there's sort of moral norms, there's epistemic norms. We have many other senses. People sometimes think about the five senses. I would argue we have much more than five senses when you really think about it, right?
Yeah.
Much more than five senses, right? And they all sort of came out of the same shop, as Reidian philosophers would want to say, right? So if one is completely bunk and delusional, why shouldn't we think that all of them are completely bunk and delusional, including reason itself, right? Now, if we've somehow reasoned to the point that now we're casting doubt on the reliability of reason itself, right? Say because you're an atheist or a naturalist and you think that we're sort of set up not necessarily to produce true beliefs, but just to get around in the world, right? To be a going concern, right? Well, now we've got a sort of epistemic mess, an epistemological mess, right? Of how are we going to get knowledge? How are we going to get warrant? All these things, right? So what I'm going to argue is that
if you cannot trust your own mind, then how do you know that you are thinking logically to reach any logical conclusion at all, right? It's self-defeating.
Yeah, it will. That's what I'm arguing, right? But it's going to be self-defeating from even denying the moral power, because I'm arguing there's a normative web and a sort of package deal here with these powers. It doesn't mean they have to be perfect, right? They're obviously not infallible. We make mistakes. But I would say we have to sort of assume that there's a general reliability here in our sort of suite of powers, right? That you can't just arbitrarily break one without breaking all of them. And once you do that, you're going to have this self-defeat issue that you're very right to talk about, right? So I think that's a big issue that most atheists miss, right? Is how tightly connected this normative web is, and how just trying to arbitrarily break one won't immediately lead to these deeper issues of self-defeat and incoherence and stuff like that, right? Of other things that they're not going to want to give up, that they're not going to want to deny. And now they might say, well, look, we can test our other senses. We can test our visual sense with our feeling sense. But it's look, you're just called into question the reliability of our senses. And now you're saying you're using that thing that you called into question to establish the thing. You're arguing in a circle now here, my friends, right? Right. You see that, right? So it's, again, it's sort of a package deal, right? All right, so that's just a few remarks on that. Other atheists, I think, can try and salvage the moral project by just getting increasingly more complex and exotic. And then they can certainly do that. But then I think you're going to have all sorts of other explanatory. So say you're like an atheistic moral Platonist, right? This is one of the options out there. And they think that, okay, we can secure objective morality by positing some realm of the forms, right? Old school Plato style, right? And we somehow participate in these forms. Well, first, I mean, there's a lot of issues with this theory, right? One is that, generally we're thinking of these forms as sort of abstract objects, so they're causally inert. How do we come to link up or participate in the forms and the right forms, right? And now you've got the theory of evolution. What does evolution care, right? How is that aiming us, right, to make sure that we come into, the form of justice rather than the form of injustice? It's just, that seems radically wild and incoherent to me, right? You don't have that issue.
Won't that go back to the same? If it's materialism and evolution, then eating each other would be cannibalism would be okay, and
well,
stealing,
it's not strictly materialist anymore, because now they're bringing in this sort of Platonic aspect, right? So this is. I'm just trying to be as gracious to the atheists as I can and show that there are options here that might seem plausible initially, but I think when you really dig into these theories at the end of the day, they have themselves internal issues that they can never quite overcome. And even if they could get up to an explanatory par with theism, now they're so much more convoluted and complex that if you think there's any virtue to having a more modest and simpler theory, theism is the easy and obvious.
I find it I find it quite difficult for an atheist to consider that there are abstract forms, because abstract things aren't those a product of a mind, and then he will have to concede that there is a backdrop of consciousness that can then, have, the capability then to project those abstract forms into reality. And I cannot see how an atheist can resort to this kind of thinking, still denying that there is anything beyond the material world that we can call God.
Yeah, well, I'm with you. I'm not a Platonist, right? So I
yeah.
don't think there's any independent realm of forms or anything like that. I'm a moderate realist, a scholastic realist, right? So I think that there's the forms in the things, and then concepts and abstractions depend on mental activity, 100%, right?
Yeah, and then even those who would argue, for example, that mathematics or laws of physics or whatever can be transcendent, then again the logical question will be, laws and mathematics can be separated from reality if they are in a mind, if somebody is thinking about them.
Right, because laws, right, they have a thought-like structure.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
So if you say, even those talking about universes from nothing and this kind of nonsense, and then they say, okay, because there's gravity, and then gravity will create this reflection of negative energy versus positive. So where does gravity come from? It's a thought, it's a law, it's something that is setting the stage. Where is it setting the stage? Somebody needs to be thinking of it to be there at all, and they would just give you no answer to that. And I find this was actually my first question, which is, how can somebody keep consistently living as an atheist and not feel miserable because he is not rationally consistent?
Yeah.
This is perplexing to me. I have not been an atheist before, but I have had a period in my life where I have considered what makes sense to believe. And so, for example, in your case, you're coming from an atheist position, and then finding that it is not rationally making any sense to you. And I'm coming from a theist perspective, and I find that atheism does not make sense to adopt, and that theism is the one that makes sense. And so that was the reason of the question. And then going back to the problem of evil, if it is the rational position to believe that there is God, I have seen another version of the problem of evil that I would like to take your opinion upon, which is, somebody will say, okay, maybe there's God, but maybe because of the problem of evil, then God is not the same person that you are describing theists. He's not the omni-benevolent creature.
Yeah,
maybe he's evil.
It's an evil God challenge, right? And that's going to come to that's the metaphysical thing that I talked about, right? That evil, upon fundamental analysis, is not on the same ontological par of good, right? To make sense of evil, there always has to be some prior good that evil either detracts from or attacks or damages, right? So whatever is most fundamental, even if you don't take a full privationist account, we need a prior conception of goodness to even make conceptual sense of evil. So evil cannot be most fundamental, right? So already there's the asymmetry to break the evil God challenge, because if God is most fundamental, goodness is most fundamental, then whatever is most fundamental, right, is going to be a good God, right? You can't, this, the whole idea of an evil God, especially in traditional metaphysics, makes no metaphysical sense and is a strict metaphysical impossibility, right? So it's only if you don't roll up your sleeves and actually do the heavy duty metaphysics that you might be kind of tricked into thinking like something like that is possible, but certainly not from a traditional metaphysical perspective, right? And I think even a superficial analysis of good and evil will show that there's again a strong asymmetry between the two here, right?
So can we phrase that as far as we look at something to be not perfectly just, it means there is an image of a more perfect justice in our mind, which means that this perfect backdrop has to be God. Otherwise, we will not feel that there is still some missing justice, or still some missing mercy, or still some missing love. Because
Right.
otherwise, if this abstract perfection completely does not exist, why are we feeling the deprivation?
Right.
So yeah,
Certainly there's these various arguments from intuitions and desires. Like, it seems like we have these, again, these strong intuitions. I do think intuitions play an important role in moral epistemology, by the way. So I would want to make a defense of intuitions and the role that they play in that. But yeah, we have these sort of intuitions of notions of like perfect justice, perfect home, perfect friendship, perfect love, perfect mercy, perfect goodness, all this or that, right? Like, they're kind of in our back pocket, so to speak. Now, the atheist might just say that this is all delusional again, but
fantasies.
right, fantasies, right? But what I want to say is, if no matter what, if you're going to make a judgment about something being bad, right, and if that judgment is going to be in the way that we commonly understand it, right, enough to lodge any sort of legitimate complaint, you need some prior conception of goodness. Like my daughter, like it would be bad. My daughter has a very beautiful face. Just take my word on it. Very beautiful face, right?
Granted.
It's bad, right? For acid to be poured on her face because her face is so beautiful, right? Right? It's so good, right? So to call that bad, right? I need something that is already good that's being attacked, being drawn away from, right? So like, we already see that conceptually, evil does not make sense without some prior goodness. And all I'm saying is actually a very modest claim, is that alone is enough to show that the impossibility of any sort of evil God challenge. And even more so if you do the full metaphysics of a privationist account, right? That God is going to be purely actual. And if you have a convertibility principle, like you do in traditional scholastic theology between goodness and being, right? That goodness and being are convertible, right? They're really talking about the same thing from kind of like different points of view. Then if God is pure being itself, pure actuality itself, God is also going to be pure goodness itself, right? So there's other moves you can make to show that the evil God is just metaphysically and philosophically incoherent. So I've never taken that one very seriously. It just doesn't strike me as even remotely a plausible candidate. But it has gotten a lot of attention in recent years because of a certain philosopher who put a paper out on it. It's been often referenced. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And some others would say maybe he's not evil, maybe he just doesn't care.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that as a philosopher?
Right. Yeah. So as a philosopher, there's a number of ways. So like, it's a deistic conception of God. Like, hey, maybe God just set things in motion, and now he wanted to go do something else. He got bored, right? And he's going.
He just doesn't care. Yeah.
Right. Well, the short response I have to this is that I think if you analyze the world metaphysically, what you realize is that it's radically contingent, right? That things exist, they don't have to exist, they don't exist in virtue of what they are, and they exist only insofar as God is constantly imparting existence to them. All right, so that's one thing, right? Just if you find that those types of arguments convincing, what I do, you realize that God didn't just, like, creation isn't a once and done thing. It's an ongoing thing. It's happening here and now. The only reason we're having this conversation is because God not just brought us into being, he sustains us into being. Now, if God is sustaining us in being, that doesn't sound like somebody who's very indifferent, right? It sounds like somebody who's doing something on purpose, intentionally, who didn't get bored, right? So the deeper metaphysics shows that God is sort of granting us existence at every moment that we do exist. That's one indicator. And then another indicator is this. Again, if you think about what love is sort of willing the good of the other, right? I think that's a fair definition of love, willing the good of the other. Well, in that sense, creation is an act of love because God is granting us the most fundamental good of all, which is the good of existence, the good which all other goods are contingent upon. He's willing it to us at every moment that we exist in an absolute gratuitous way. There's nothing we could have done to earn it because we didn't exist before we got it, right? So it's complete gift. So this shows that God is not only indifferent. I would say that there's an argument here philosophically that God is also eternally loving. He's literally loving us into existence by giving us that most primordial good of all, which is that active existence. So I think you can go a long way, and I'm just giving sketches of the arguments here, but I think you can go a long way, even philosophically, apart from revelation, to show that God is not indifferent. He's active here and now, and he's active in his love here and now.
It's a very good response. Let me hit you with this. So some would use this contingency argument, and they would go, okay, so you're saying God is the sustainer. By the way, one of the names of God in Islam is he is the Qayyum, is sustainer. He's emanating existence and
Right.
taking care of it every single moment. But some would go like this: if he is the sustainer and he is sustaining everybody's existence and livelihood, then it means that he is also willing that horrible people exist, and
Right.
they're doing all those bad things with the tools that he's giving them.
Mhm.
And even in the very moment that they're committing those atrocities, he continues sustaining
He
them.
gives them existence. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
they say it's inconsistent with his omnibenevolence, and then they start hitting back to the
right. Yeah. All right. Let's build this one out, because I want to grant all of that. Right. I want to say that yeah, if when the bad guy goes to stab the innocent woman, he's only able to do that because God has kept that bad guy in existence, and the knife and all of it. I want to grant that, right? But is God morally responsible for that, right? Is that something that God, we would say, sort of like actively wills? And I want to say no. The theist has many moves that they can make here, right? I'm going to go back. This is going to take a little bit, but I think hopefully it'll be worth it, right? I'm a libertarian when it comes to human freedom. I think that's perfectly compatible with divine universal causality and all of that. We can talk about that if we want, right? But let's say this, right? Only God is goodness itself, right? Only God is the subsistent good itself. I'm just going to kind of paint a metaphysical picture here that I think is right. So that means only God is impeccable. Only God is perfect, right? Only God's will is perfect, right? Anything else God creates is going to not be its own moral standard, right? Because only God is the moral standard. With me so far, right? Now,
Yep.
say that God wants to bring about something really good. Say that God wants to bring about a community of love, and I think God does want to do that, right? Well, love requires the meeting of two independent free wills. Well, God's will is free, but it's also impeccable. But we just said, and I think we can give more arguments for this if you want, that anything else that God creates, if it's going to be free, is also going to be fallible because it's not going to be its own rule, right? So now we're starting to see a picture emerge where if God wants to create a particular world with particular goods, it might entail a particular risk, right? It might entail bringing in free creatures that are liable to failure, right? Now, let's pause here, because somebody might ask, well, couldn't God do something like give special graces all the time to stop us from failing, to always consider the right thing? And I actually want to say, yes, God could do that, right? And it wouldn't be a violation of human freedom. Now, this is a great debate among Christians and many different philosophers and this, that. But my position is actually God could do that, right? He could preserve us in a particular moral state with grace and stuff like that. However, I would want to say this about that would be akin to God creating a natural order and just performing nonstop miracles, right? Constant intervention in a natural order, and really just never letting things be the type of thing that they are. And God, in virtue of being perfectly rational and wise, if he's going to create a natural order, he's going to let it be a natural order, right? He might do exceptions here and there. He might work miracles here and there as it works towards his general plan. But in the general run, a wise God is going to govern things according to the type of thing that it is. He's going to govern electrons according to their nature most of the time. He's going to govern humans according to their nature most of the time. What is our nature? We're free beings, but we're fallibly free beings, right? And as it happens, not only could we fail, we have failed. Most of us fail every single day, right? So God permits this. Doesn't mean that he wants it, but he permits it. Now, why does God permit it? Well, one, because it might be a sort of necessary risk to bring about the supreme good, which is friendships, communion, and love. And there's nothing morally wrong about about allowing for some possibly bad thing to happen for a really, really good thing to happen. There's nothing wrong with that. We do that all the time, right? I mean, at some point, my kids are going to be driving. And that's good. It gives them greater autonomy. They can help grandma with the groceries, but there's the possibility that they could seriously kill somebody or themselves, right? But nobody thinks that I've done a bad thing by allowing for that possibility, right? Now, if I actively willed and slashed the tires and like demanded that they kill somebody, that'd be an issue, right? But just allowing the possibility isn't an issue, right? So God allows the possibility of our failure because of this supreme good of friendships, love, and communion with himself. Plus, God is so omnipotent. God is so great that even when we fail, God can use that for even greater goods. And now we have the possibility for even more goods to come on the scene. What would some of those goods be? How about mercy? How about compassion? How about empathy, right? How about courage? How about all these other really, really good goods that just wouldn't be there if God just constantly intervened, constantly performed miracles to stop us from failing all the time, right? So now we have, I think, a really beautiful picture where God respects the creatures that he's created in the general run, governs them according to the types of things that they are, permits their evils to achieve the conditions, the arena that's necessary for the highest good of all, which is friendships, communion, and love, and can, in his providence, draw out greater goods from any of the failures that we have in life as well. And so, those bad things would not happen metaphysically if God didn't impart existence to the natural order, but he has imparted existence to the natural order. He permits our failures, and look, we have an obligation to fight against those evils, right? It doesn't alleviate our obligation to fight against evils, but certainly there's no injustice on God's part from sustaining the positive aspects of the reality when it is our failure, right? God doesn't cause our failure. He keeps the positive aspects of us in being, but it's us as libertarian free agents that bring in the absurdity of sin, right? That privation of a particular, really, when it comes to sin, the privation there is a consideration of a moral rule that should have applied to a judgment that we didn't attach to a particular judgment. So it's something at the end of the day that's missing that should have been there, and it's our fault that it's not there, not God's fault. So that'd be my general way of responding to a very, very thorny and thoughtful issue, but it's one that I think can ultimately be overcome. Mm-hmm.
And it's one that is amazingly to me pretty consistent with my tradition. So
good, yeah, it's good.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Well, I know Islam, like Christianity, right? There's I imagine that there's many people in the Islamic tradition that would not feel that that's consistent, but there's because I've had enough conversations and all really good conversations with people of different faiths, and the one thing that I've learned is, just like Christianity, there's even within tradition, there's many people who think differently within that tradition about these particular types of issues. But I'm glad to hear that there's consistency on between our accounts. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there is one extra element actually that I think is, from my point of view, can also balance the bigger picture, which is that this life is not everything. Actually, that this life is a very small thing, given the grand picture, which is an eternal, a future eternal life after this one, where justice is served. And if mathematically you divide anything by infinity, the result would be zero. So let's say that there are injustices in this world, which I think is something that everybody can agree upon. Some people get oppressed and lead a miserable life, and they die in poverty or in oppression, destitution, and
other people seem to get away with truly evil things as well. Right?
Absolutely, and the guy who pulled the trigger or who took their wealth, just dies with a couple of minutes of pain, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
But what really completes the picture is that this life, no matter how many years somebody lives, 90, 100, 120, or even 1,000, is nothing compared to eternal happiness or eternal misery. And hence, if somebody lives a life of suffering and he is really recompensed for his patience and for his appreciation that this is just a test ground for a bigger cause,
mm-hmm.
of finding the ones who have exemplified the right morals or the right attitude towards the various sufferings and even indulgences that they have experienced. Because, for example, in Islam, and I'm sure also in Christianity, this life, every moment of it is a test. You might be tested by pain or gain. So if you're poor, it's a test of patience, maybe. And if you're rich, it's also a test for gratitude. And definitely there is always a test for gratitude, because number one, we exist, just as we have the gift of existence and the gift of being human and the gift of having a body and senses and mind and everything. And so when somebody says, how would he leave this guy get away with it? I would add something to your response, is that this guy who has caused oppression towards you is giving you the opportunity, number one, to fight back against oppression, which is a good deed, so you will be rewarded for it. Number two, if you fight back against oppression and you lose, or even you lose your life, you're a martyr, and this is also good for you. And number three, if there is somebody else who is oppressed and you stand with him and you help him, somebody took his money and you give him charity, somebody is badly sick and you put him in a hospital or something, somebody's fighting for freedom and you support him, etc., then it's not only a test ground where some people are getting away with horrible atrocities, but it's also an opportunity for other people to be rewarded for magnificent positions that they can take versus such atrocities being committed or injustices. And at the end of the day, nothing is compared to an eternal life. So somebody who has been the worst person in this life for 50 years, if he's put into hell for 50,000 years, that's for sure a very good retribution. So I think, of course, when you go with an atheist and tell him about this, he doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in hereafter, doesn't believe in souls or anything.
Yeah.
So he'll just categorically reject the argument. But
yeah,
then,
but here's the important point, right? Is like how they do that without being flagrantly question begging is the key, right? Because if and I think you're right, is that like, look, if we have like all of eternity and an afterlife where we really can experience the highest possible goods, right? That will infinitely outweigh any of the trials and sufferings we have in this life, seems like a pretty good deal. And then the atheist will say, well, no, that can't be the case. Well, how can you do that without just flagrantly begging the question at that point? And I don't think it can be done, right? So now we just need to have, just independent considerations or something like that. So yeah, I always find there's sort of like, I don't know, just arrogant dismissals of that just to be horrendously question begging, right? It's like, look, if we're talking about comparing theories, my theory has this component, right? Which actually helps to make a lot of sense of the problem of evil, right? And in fact, if my theory didn't have that component, right, here's another way to think about it, right? If you think independently that God exists and is all good, and that you think that God couldn't allow any, let's say, gratuitous evils. This is a term that's in the literature a lot, like evils that could not be justified by anything or greater reasons. And so you think that's the case, which I do think that's the case, right? I don't think any evils are ultimately gratuitous, ultimately. Now, if you thought that this life was all there is, and if that was the case, some evils would be gratuitous, well, now you just have independent reason to think that this life isn't all there is, right? Given your prior commitment to theism, right? And then if you already have a particular religious commitment that has an afterlife component in it, well, then now we again have some very strong, serious, evidential weight of something like that, right? For sure. So now all your points are well taken. Again, there's a lot, I think, shared commitments there between our traditions, right? And like this isn't entirely unique to Judaism, Christianity, or Islam either. I mean, many pagans have thought that some type of afterlife was sort of something that just kind of flowed from their deeper considerations of fundamental reality and goodness and justice and stuff like that as well. So it's got a lot of independent support as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I want to share this with you. So I was yesterday and today thinking about some of the arguments, and I portrayed this image in my mind. So I'd like to share that with you today. So from various discussions. So let's imagine this, that we have a battalion, or we have an army that we want to pick the best warriors. Okay, we want to recognize the best ones and to fire the bad ones, because when the real war is here, we want to be really ready. Yeah. So what do? We do a war game. We do a maneuver, right? And we'll take the guys and we'll split them into a red team and a blue team, and we'll say, guys, you will go into the battlefield, which is not a real battlefield, and you'll do the drill, and then we'll pick. But then our problem is that in this boot camp, or in this drill, people know that it is a drill, and so we start putting in some some good effects. So we have cannons firing, we have sounds of shots, and but we still know that the guns that they have are not real ones. So we give them real guns, but they know they cannot kill somebody, so it's just like, it's still fake.
Mhm.
And then somebody comes in with this great new technology and says, guess what, guys, you can give them real bullets, we can fire real shells on them, and we will observe the whole thing, and we'll know the real courageous ones, and the ones who carried the wounded, and the one who fought so courageously, and we will be able to revive them later. And then they will be, recognized, and they will get the medals and everything. Not only that, but now some of the guys on the test field will say, but if we shoot, then we know that you will revive him, but they will have pain. But then we think that the greater good for having a real ready army that will defend the millions of populations from suffering atrocities is more important than this. So somebody comes with a new technology where you can wipe the memories of the soldiers before coming into the battlefield. So they would think it is a real battlefield. So they think this is real war, and they think they are really in danger, and this is really the enemy. And then now everybody is doing the exact thing that he will do in a real war, because he thinks it's the real thing. And we're firing real shells, and they have real guns, and the people are wounded, who are really wounded. And then you will really see who are the guys who are going to come to the wounded, who are the guys who will be at the front lines, and who are the cowards who are going to run away.
Mhm.
And this will take place in a week or something, and then it stops, and the dead are revived, and the good are recognized, and the cowards are punished, and everybody gets his memory back.
Mhm.
And it's not like there is people with technology. It is God is doing this. We are here for this amount of time, and it makes sense that this whole battlefield is having shells on them and is having disasters, because then it seems so real, and we act real. Because otherwise, if there are those continuous miracles, and whenever somebody will, break an ankle, somebody says, stop the drill and get this guy out of here,
Right.
it will never be the right thing to do to find the real right one. So I
Yeah.
just got this whole parable in my mind. I
Yeah,
thought
yeah.
sharing it with you.
But I mean, this comes to like, so here we kind of like, maybe are we talking about a defense or a theodicy? When it comes to defenses, you see this a fair amount in the literature. It's just like people will just say, well, hey, look, here's a possibility, right? And that's all you need. That's all you need to take down the problem of evil. Whether that's the actuality or whether it's something different doesn't really matter, right? Because we're just showing why the argument doesn't go through, because it hasn't closed off particular possibilities, right? And there's actually some really fun kind of exotic defenses out there that I probably don't think are true at the end of the day, some of them, but they're enough to. So again, it's like, to my mind, it's just trying to help people understand like what we're doing at different times when responding to these types of challenges, right? So I actually like entertaining a lot of those types of things, even though, I have more particular commitments, obviously, as a Christian and a Catholic, of how I would ultimately at the end of the day think about a lot of this stuff. But I still think it's kind of just an interesting philosophical exercise, if nothing else. I was talking with a guy not too long ago who's kind of a general theist, and he thinks that, yeah, God just creates sort of infinitely many universes at sort of random, and allows us to kind of like enter into them voluntarily, right, to try and form better worlds, having kind of our memory erased and stuff like that. So he gave kind of a story that wasn't completely dissimilar to yours. I'm like, that's really interesting, guy. It seems like it would totally justify, you know, a lot of what we see. So it's like it covers a range of data and really takes down the problem of evil in many respects. So yeah, I mean, that's just something that philosophers do, theistic philosophers who, you know, whether or not they're attached to a particular tradition, when engaged in what's called a defense, I think all those types of moves are very legitimate, right? Because that's you know, that's what objections are. They're argument testers. Objections are meant to see how strong an argument is. Can we break an argument? And I think there's lots that break the problem of evil. We've gone just through a few today, but there's a lot more that we haven't even considered. So yeah, good stuff. I do have to jet here in a couple minutes though.
So I think we have gone through a lot. So number one, thank you for being here. I think it has been quite an entertaining discussion.
Oh, absolutely, my pleasure.
I hope it's not going to be the last one. Maybe we'll have further encounters about this, or maybe some of the cosmological arguments, or what have you. And let me ask you this one final thing.
Sure.
That some people will just throw at you when you're talking about the problem of evil. They would tell you, okay, what might justify children getting cancer, for example? What would be the response to that?
Yeah, well, this is what we call a sort of mysterious evil, right? And the idea of a mysterious evil is an evil where it's, again, we don't see that there is no good explanation or reason for it, but maybe it's something where we don't see what the good explanation or reason for it is. So mostly I would just say, on what worldview are mysterious evils better predicted, right? Are they better predicted on God's existence, or are they better predicted on atheism? And this just brings back in, now look, people don't like this because it's very abstract, but I think when we're doing philosophy, we have to be abstract. We have to follow reason where it leads and not get tied up in very emotional and hard examples. And what's harder than that? I mean, nothing's harder than, I mean, I have my own children, right? Nothing would break my heart more than if any of them got sick and died. So I understand the emotional weight of that. And this is why at the beginning I was very clear, let's draw a very quick divide between the emotional and lived problem of evil and the philosophical problem of evil. And my general response is, look, if God exists and creates the sort of arenas that we've talked about, God is going to see things that I don't see and can't see. God's going to have God-sized reasons that Pat, as a finite, very limited being, just is, I don't see how everything connects. God does. So I shouldn't be surprised that there are going to be tragedies in life where I don't immediately see why God is permitting this. That's expected on theism. That's actually exactly the sort of thing I would expect. Maybe I can't specify exactly what that's going to look like, but that things like that will occur is not surprising given God's existence. Would I expect mysterious evils if God didn't exist? No, for the same reasons that I've talked about before. I wouldn't expect any evil. I wouldn't expect any problem evil, because I wouldn't expect, frankly, I wouldn't expect any universe at all. I certainly wouldn't expect fine tuning. I wouldn't expect complex creatures of any kind. I wouldn't expect sentient life. I wouldn't expect reasoning agents. I wouldn't expect moral agents. I wouldn't expect moral communities. I wouldn't expect grief. None of that would I expect if God didn't exist. So in that sense, on the final analysis, these mysterious evils, again, are a data point that I think counts in, toward God's existence rather than away from. So you can just take any of those sort of very hard, tragic examples, and I think you can kind of plug them back into my general argument of why evil is evidence for rather than away from the existence of God. And we just have to be upfront with people and say, look, this is painful, right? We all suffer tremendously. So I'm not downplaying those examples. But as a philosopher, our job is to follow reason where it leads, right? And make sure reason is guiding the emotions and everything else. And that's the most a philosopher can do at the end of the day. So I hope that helps people if that's something that they're struggling with. Yeah.
I think it should. And I would add to that given the hereafter, God will also, in Islam at least, I think also in Christianity, but I'm not sure, but I think so. Children who die as children before puberty, they always go to heaven.
Well, yeah, certainly there's
yeah.
evidence. So let me say that, right? And there's other good evidence. So take one thing I've researched a lot of are near-death experiences, right? And there's really good evidence for the veridical data on near-death experiences. And something that's commonly found are that parents meet their, in this heavenly realm, they meet their deceased children, miscarried children, children that had diseases or deformities are there and they're healed. All that's great news, right?
And
all
they
that,
have enjoyment for eternity. Maybe
right.
they don't get the same level of experience like people who really had free will and the possibility of sin and good deeds, but they have been saved a risk, and they have a free ticket to heaven. And us as parents, God forbid, if anybody has this kind of experience, we also have a great opportunity to show patience and still gratitude to God, and it will help us in our growth, and it will definitely help us to go to paradise, accepting this as something that we need to deal with, some of the difficulties of life that we need to pass through this arena, let's say. So let's close by that, and I hope you have the rest of your day as a great day.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ahmed. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much, Pat, and let's have this happen once more sometime soon, and have some great day, guys. You have the ticker, and it has Pat's website, which will lead you to all his other stuff. I think you have the main thing around iTunes, right?
That's correct.
And then he has a YouTube channel. He has two of them, actually. One of them is called Philosophy for the People. Is that correct?
That's right.
And another one, which is more like it's a gymnastic one, right?
Yeah, it's just a generalist podcast. We talk about lots of different things: fitness, philosophy, theology, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So people can check it out if they want.
Yeah. So I'll put all of them in the description if you'd send them to me. And thank you for being here, and have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pat. All right. So let's put the extra, and I will see you all again soon. Here we go.